Hi, I'm Robert Cornegy Jr., running for Brooklyn Borough President.
Okay, so you've been around. People know you, especially this year. I mean, I feel like I've seen you all the time, walking around at events, press conferences and stuff. But for people who don't know you, what are your ties to Brooklyn? Where are you from? Where do you live with your family? That sort of stuff.
So I am solidly a Bed-Stuy resident, and I represent, obviously, Bed-Stuy and Northern Crown Heights as the council member. But I'm a Bed-Stuy guy. I'm a son of a pastor here in Bed-Stuy, so we were raised on servant leadership here in Bedford-Stuyvesant.
Okay. And the fact that you've been working in the city council for a long time obviously has gotten you some name recognition, and opponents would say, oh, we want somebody with fresh eyes and a new outlook. But why is it beneficial to have someone like yourself who has been working in the city council since 2014, is very close with the borough president who could become the next mayor? How could that help push Brooklyn forward?
I mean, I think the reality is that we're only as good as our ability to leverage our professional and personal relationships for the benefit of the constituency that we serve. And so I measure my tenure by my ability to leverage those relationships, city, state, and federal, with my colleagues, plus with lawmakers, plus with responsible developers, as an opportunity to give us what we need as a borough.
Okay. If you had to say one thing that you were most proud of in the time you spent in city council, what would you say that would be?
So it's difficult for me to say that, quite frankly, Sabrina, because as someone who's in the top 10 percentile of substantive legislation produced, I think we've done a lot. I will say that we're one of the only council members who's actually produced a piece of legislation in every committee that I sit on. Generally, the committee that you chair is where you focus your attention and intention and funnel all of your legislation through that. I've had the pleasure of not doing that. And that's primarily because what a lot of people don't know is before getting elected, I was a staffer. I was a legislative policy analyst on the committees of actually on veterans and seniors. So those two committees, I actually wrote legislation and policy. I literally moved from the 14th floor to the 17th floor when I got elected. And it's that kind of experience that I think is incredibly important to bring to bear for the borough of Brooklyn.
Okay, so why borough president then? Because that's definitely a different kind of position. It's more of a community-based, interaction-based position than it would be going to city council every day.
Right, so I'm glad you mentioned that, right? So much has been said about the powers or lack thereof of the borough president. I served in the last legislative session as the chair of small business, and in the current legislative session as the chair of housing and building, which I believe are the two pillars of recovery and resiliency. That's where the power actually of the borough president lies. Through zoning and through access to over $60 million in capital funding, you can help shape the borough. I solidly do that today on a consistent basis as the chair of housing and buildings. And the recovery and resiliency opportunities that are available to small businesses in this borough, I can lead from the perspective of having been the chair of small business and creating everything from chamber on the go to reducing fines and fees for small businesses. So we know that that is the wave of how we get true recovery and resiliency. And that's what makes me a nuanced brand of leadership for the borough, leveraging both of those levels of acumen in small business and in responsible development as the chair of housing and building.
Okay, so that's a good segue too, because obviously rezoning, the whole ULURP process is something that's a hot button issue for people that are feeling like they're being displaced, or for instance, you voted in favor, or not voted, you weighed in favor of the Industry City proposal. A lot of the community was not in favor of that proposal because they felt it was just going to raise rents even higher and get them pushed out of their neighborhood. So how can we go about creating responsible ULURP proposals? What made you decide to weigh in favor of Industry City in that instance? Or would you keep doing that?
Well, a couple of responses. One is there is reform that's absolutely necessary on the ULURP process, and I intend to leave a legacy as the chair of housing and buildings of weighing in on the ULURP process and making it more equitable for our communities. I weighed in on how the policy stands today, and I weighed in on the side of job creation. So while I'm not an economist, nor do I play one on television. You don't have to be to understand that the way to true recovery and resiliency is through job creation. And whether it was 8,000 jobs or 20,000 jobs, there was an opportunity to get hardworking Brooklynites back on the path to be able to feed their families. And I'm going to always be in favor of job creation. And you can count on that from my borough president's role to have a solid focus on these hard decisions around creating jobs. That was a perfect opportunity, I believe, for job creation and to put the borough and its ancillary communities, because I believe that the axis of the universe shifts on the borough of Brooklyn, to be able to set the tone for how we create jobs in the city of New York from a borough of Brooklyn perspective. A lot of people don't realize that we are a maritime city, and the underutilization of our waterways is almost criminal. We should be accessing our waterways. We should be using it for commerce. And whether it's industry cities or the Navy Yard, the ability to create jobs through access to our waterways should be a priority. And I'll make that a priority as the next borough president.
How would you want to reform the Euler process if you were given the chance?
So well, I'm going to have the chance because I chair the Committee on Housing and Buildings. And I'm going to sit down with some of those people who are opposed and really get their opinion on what it should look like, what is really necessary in the Euler process to include communities at the beginning. So we know that there's an absence of community involvement in there, and that's what people screamed about. I believe that we can get the necessary reforms and responsible development so that we can move this borough forward. And I'm going to do that through the Euler process.
Got it. Shifting a little bit to the idea that Brooklyn needs an insane amount of affordable housing. So how would you intend on going about creating space for people who feel like they're getting pushed out? They can't find space for their family, that there's no 3-bedroom apartments in Brooklyn. So how do you reason with that?
Well, listen, as somebody who represents what is probably the epicenter of gentrification and displacement here in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, you can't get to a place of affordability without responsible development. And also without preserving the affordable units. Every year, annually, we lose more units than we actually can create, and it's a vicious cycle. From the borough president's perspective, we have to do a wholesale of the affordable units. We have to look at when they're sunsetting and talk to developers before they sunset. That's one of the big problems that we have. For every 1 unit that we create, we lose 10. Because we don't even have a robust understanding of what's sunsetting and what programs are now unavailable. So from a borough president's perspective, I intend to look at the borough in its entirety, speak to developers way before their projects are sunsetting to make sure that we can preserve as much affordable housing as we want to create. And then there's got to be a pathway to affordable home ownership. The Mitchell-Lama program, we're in the process as Chair of Housing and Buildings of working with our state colleagues to create a Mitchell-Lama 2.0. There hasn't been 1 unit of affordable housing through the Mitchell-Lama program created since 1979. It's ridiculous. We have to revamp that program. We know for a fact, and in my district, where there's DASNY-owned property, that we can get a Mitchell-Lama 2.0, and I'm working on that currently. And I want to do the same thing for the entire borough.
Talking about the dynamics between the NYPD and the people of Brooklyn. Obviously, there's been a mass movement to reform the NYPD over this past year. So where do you stand on that? Because I know in the past you've mentioned that, and I've witnessed this too, like people that live in areas where there is a higher crime rate, they tend to be more so on the side of reform rather than abolish or replace or defund. So where do you fall in that spectrum?
So listen, my community has never asked for abolishment or defunding. They've asked for policing in our communities that doesn't violate our civil and human rights. I represent a community where 6 months ago, a 1-year-old baby in his stroller was killed. And most recently, a 70-year-old woman on public transportation on the Black Lives Matter mural was shot in the face. So that's an argument that I don't get to have. I don't get the luxury of just having this lofty idea. There has to be a relationship between NYPD, which is with its 36,000 officers and 8 million people. There's no way you get to the safest big city in the world without collaboration between the two. We've worked really hard. I've been around long enough to find a sustainable method, I think, for changing the culture. When I first started getting involved in public service, the cadet classes were 6% Black, Latino, and Asian. We are now at 60% of the graduating classes from the NYPD cadet school being representative of the communities that they serve in. That's a longer, more sustainable way of changing the culture, because everybody agrees that their culture will change. Now, I juxtapose that with being the sponsor, the co-sponsor, one of the co-sponsors, one of the 3 prime sponsors of the Eric Garner chokehold bill. So I am solidly for reform and demand it, but not at the risk of public safety. And there's a place that we can get to, I believe, and we've begun that process of protecting and serving and making sure our communities are safe while holding the NYPD accountable and having reforms.
Okay. I know that this is the last policy question, then I have like 3 fast, fun questions. Anti-crime is something that Borough President Eric Adams has said he would want to replace with something better. Is that an image that you see for the future in Brooklyn or in the city as a whole?
Absolutely. In my community, a lot of the anti-crime work was just that, where they were on the front lines thwarting this rising gun violence, right? Gun violence, in order to stop it or intersect it, it takes 2 components. One is our credible messages and the crisis management system that really beats back the retaliatory violence that comes from shootings. And then there is the preventive portion of that, which we found solidly in the anti-crime unit. Now, they were notorious for horrible behavior in our communities, right? In the hood, they call them the jump out boys, because they were, traditionally borderline harassing people who, and a lot of it was through the use of the stop and frisk program. We no longer have stop and frisk as a program, and that reform should lead to the reforms in anti-crime. It should come under another name, but we should have people in a preventive posture in the NYPD so that people can be safe. So homeowners and children and seniors can live a safe existence and don't have to remain sheltered in their home when this ugly pandemic is lifted. We have 2 pandemics happening simultaneously, this rising gun violence and the obvious pandemic as it relates to health and COVID-19.